Brock Lawley Show.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Brock Lawley program. My name is Brock Lawley, and this is going to be the segment where we dragnet the news. And as my radio mentor reminds me, I need to remind the audience, what does that even mean, dragnet the news? Well, what it means is we're going to cover the news again. Let's just be honest, we get hit with a tsunami of news every week, and most of it just doesn't actually soak in. And so what I'm going to do is do the heavy lifting. I'm going to get down into that sewage pipe that is the mainstream media news, and I'm going to pull out the little gems, the morsels, the golden nuggets, sifting out the lies, the leftist media lies from the golden wheat of truth for your reality television ADD minds, serving it up on a silver platter for you. So, I think it's a service to humanity, one man's opinion. By now you might have heard that in Texas, of all places, and boy, does irony have a way of playing games with us, if you preach from the pulpit, you turn your sermons into the state. Not unconstitutional at all. No. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how much more blatant trampling of religious freedom can get before the rest of us are just like, enough is enough. Remarkable. The pendulum shift that has taken place in this nation. A nation built from the pulpit. A nation ideologically structured, guided through the many different trials and turbulence of this nation's history from the pulpit. Now, the state needs to see those sermons, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure we get the Brave New World, the 1984 whiteout pens, and sanitize them. Make sure there's none of that Bible speak in there. I don't know. I mean, I could soapbox on this for days. All I can tell you is you're going to live in the country that you choose to live in. And this stuff is so out of control that I'm guessing even Democrats have got to be like, we got to pump the brakes at some point. Listen, my fellow citizens on the left, people don't have to agree with everything you think. You see, it just begins and it ends there. And it's not really complicated. They're not horrible people. They're not evil people. They're not monsters because they don't agree with people on the Upper East Side of New York about everything under the sun. And you certainly have no right to use the strong arm of the state to control what people think and say. End of discussion. It's not complicated. It's like the Second Amendment in that way. It's really, really clear. It's easy to understand, really. And the irony parade continues to roll because the New York Times had this huge, elaborate piece involving video and research, dropping a bomb, actually, proving that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. And now ISIS actually moving into the areas where those stockpiles were. I suppose that's why it's coming to light now. This is something that hits home with me. I actually saw it. I knew this for a long time. The media obviously politicized this issue during the Bush era because, quite frankly, it was a politically expedient way for the left to gain power. They were undermining the military. They were undermining the mission in every turn. I remember it vividly. Nobody can talk me out of it. In fact, I have stories that would bend your imagination by way of catching the media in lies, and I'll share them with you in the weeks and months ahead. But this one I saw with my own eyes. I saw in the south of Iraq. I saw the chemical burns on the children's faces. I saw the chemical burns on the women's faces. I saw that Saddam had gassed his own people. This idea that there wasn't WMD in Iraq is just preposterous. And of course, this story that the New York Times releases has video of the military finding all kinds of stockpiles of this stuff. So just goes to show you the media malfeasance. And certainly, at least on this front, Bush is completely vindicated. And I have my problems with George W. Bush. You need to hear me saying that. It wasn't just the American intelligence that determined that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence community worldwide all were in agreement with that. The UN was in agreement with that. Democrats actually asked for a second vote so they could be in favor of the war. This whole thing was politicized. And of course, lately, the Bush perspective on the war, week after week after week, it is just becoming more and more vindicated. Since your media will never tell you this, I have for you some of the greatest hits from the Democrats prior to invasion of Iraq. And I'm willing to bet that most of you have never heard this highlight reel.
Or we take some ambiguous third route, which gives him yet more opportunities to develop this program of weapons of mass destruction and continue to press for the release of the sanctions and continue to ignore the solemn commitments that he made.
Saddam Hussein certainly has chemical and biological weapons. There's no question about that.
We know he continues to attempt to gain access to additional capability, including nuclear capability.
Saddam Hussein, in effect, has thumbed his nose at the world community. And I think that the president is approaching this in the right fashion.
I can support the president. I can support an action against Saddam Hussein because I think it's in the long-term interest of our national security.
When I made the decision to remove Saddam Hussein from power, Congress approved it with strong bipartisan support. It is deeply irresponsible to rewrite the history of how that war began. As our troops fight a ruthless enemy determined to destroy our way of life, they deserve to know that their elected leaders who voted to send them to war continue to stand behind them.
I play that for you so that you, my fellow Americans, can remember clearly the past, because there is millions and millions and millions of dollars spent in an effort to make sure that you don't. What you're seeing in the foreign policy landscape today falls in the lap of the people in power, because they chose power over doing what is right, because they chose political elections over doing, again, one of the few things the federal government should do, which is national security. Infrastructure, rule of law, national security. Ask yourself, which one of those things is your federal government actually doing at this point in time? Airstrikes are not working. ISIS is actually taking ground, and ISIS comes out this week and boasts again their enslavement of the Yazidi women. Talking with pride in a slick monthly magazine, talking about this enslavement rape culture that they've put these women through proudly in this sleek monthly magazine that they put out. EnglishArabia.net. Horrific news coming on the foreign policy front. Turkey actually attacking Kurds, one of our allies in this thing, and refusing to attack ISIS. Turkey, by the way, in NATO. Just goes to show you how ridiculous this quote-unquote coalition that we have going on, this motley crew that we're trumpeting as the solution to this problem. This thing can't be any worse. There is no way to spray Febreze on this thing. The White House is trying like crazy, but this is just off the rails. But in case you're worried, don't be worried. I'm going to put those worries to bed, because you see the Pentagon unveils this week a plan for the military's response to climate change in the face of enemies on every front. Under Obama's administration, we are putting our men and women in uniform to good use, and that is fighting a man-made global warming myth perpetrated by leftist hoaxsters funded by people like Tom Steyer. Follow the money on that one, by the way, the Billionaires Club. Every single week, the politics as science is refuted, and yet we are taking the tip of the spear of the United States in a time of unprecedented military vulnerability, and we're going to fight climate change, cow flatulence. You can't make this stuff up. You can't be any more out of touch than this. But these are the actual news headlines this week in your country. Sometimes I can't even believe it myself as it rolls off my lips. There's a piece this week in the New York Times that asks the question, is Francis leading the church leftward? To be honest with you, I don't really trust the New York Times, but Francis is no Benedict, and I've had a lot of problems with some of the things that he's done. I think the man's a good man, but I certainly don't agree with him politically. There's a fascinating piece in the New York Times about that. All kinds of craziness popping off in Ferguson. Another kid gets shot. Media just conveniently forgets to tell you. It was double-fisted blasting off with 9mm at the cops, and then what do you know? He gets shot. My guess is when you get out your guns and you start shooting at the cops, you're going to get put down, regardless of the color of your skin, but not the way the media chose to report it. Also, 2 cops shot in Ferguson. So interesting to look at the race relations in the United States of America post Barack Obama's presidency. I don't know that race relations have been this bad since Jim Crow. I would say that that's purposeful. There was a story this week in the Washington Post about an American suicide bomber traveling freely in the United States of America. The interesting thing about this story is they said the guy blew himself up in Syria. I don't really know why ISIS brought him back from the United States, but the whole thing, of course, should sound an alarm about ISIS militants being in our midst. And of course, our southern border is like a screen door in the spring, and our enemy is like a tropical rainstorm. And this should concern everybody. Blue states, red states, it should be troubling to every citizen. It certainly isn't troubling to Washington, D.C., that's for sure. There was a huge fact check story about another liberal myth in the Wall Street Journal this week about that pay gap between the average worker and CEOs. Turns out when you actually look at the real numbers, in other words, when you don't just spout off political pablum, but you actually look at the numbers, it only exists this kind of huge gap when you take a very, very small slice of CEOs running massive companies. And of course, we all know the average company in this country is a small business. So this whole class warfare built on total and complete lies, leftist lies. But if you're interested in that story, Wall Street Journal has a really great expose on that. BrockLawleyMusic.com, The Brock Lawley Show, iHeartRadio, WMANFM.com. We'll be right back.